Chapter 1. Born to Fight. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not born like everyone else. No. She came into the world on November 12, 1815, in a small town called Johnstown, New York. From the outside, her life seemed perfect. Her family was wealthy, her home was grand, and she was surrounded by privilege. But even in a house as big as hers, Elizabeth noticed something deeply wrong. Unfairness, injustice, and she noticed it early. Little Elizabeth was smart, very smart. She was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to know more. She would sit for hours, listening to her father, Daniel Cady, who was a respected judge and lawyer. His books filled the house, and Elizabeth loved to read them. She would run her fingers over the pages, feeling the power in the words. But there was a problem. Elizabeth wasn't supposed to want that kind of knowledge. She wasn't supposed to be as smart as the boys. Why? Because she was a girl. Her brothers had more opportunities. They went to school, studied at college, and learned about the law. Elizabeth? She was told her place was at home. She could read, yes, but only certain things. She could learn, but not too much. A girl's mind was not meant for big ideas, they said. It was meant for simple things, like sewing and cooking. This made no sense to Elizabeth. She knew, deep in her heart, that her mind was just as strong, just as capable as any boy's. Then something happened that changed everything. Elizabeth's brother, Eleazar, died when she was just 11 years old. The loss was heartbreaking. She loved him dearly, but what her father said after his death left a mark on her soul. "Oh, Elizabeth," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I wish you were a boy." His words, they cut her deeply. They weren't meant to hurt, but they did. It was as if her father, the man she admired most, saw no value in her, just because she was a girl. She was stunned, but inside something shifted. A fire ignited. She wouldn't accept this unfairness. She wouldn't sit quietly. No. Elizabeth was going to prove that she could be more than what society expected. She would fight. Fight for herself, for other women, for equality. But how? How could a young girl challenge the rules of society? She didn't know yet. But what she did know was that she had to learn. She had to be strong. She had to be ready. Elizabeth threw herself into her studies. She learned Greek, Latin, math, and philosophy, subjects that were usually reserved for boys. Her father didn't stop her. Perhaps he saw her determination. Perhaps he even admired it. Elizabeth worked hard, harder than anyone else. She wanted to show the world that she could do anything, be anything, regardless of her gender. Her mind was sharp, and her arguments were passionate. She loved to debate. She would stand in front of her father's law books and pretend to be a lawyer, just like him. But outside her home, the world was not so easy. Johnstown was a small town, and its people believed in old traditions. Girls were expected to marry, have children, and live quiet lives. But Elizabeth didn't want a quiet life. She wanted more. She dreamed of a world where women could be free. Free to learn, free to vote, free to have a voice. Her family, especially her father, didn't always understand her. They were proud of her intelligence, but they worried that her strong will might make her life difficult. After all, a woman who spoke her mind wasn't always welcome. Elizabeth could feel the weight of their expectations, but she refused to let it crush her dreams. There was one person who did believe in Elizabeth, her cousin, Gerrit Smith. He was a passionate abolitionist, someone who fought for the freedom of enslaved people. Gerrit's home was a place of activism, of ideas. When Elizabeth visited him, she felt alive, inspired by the conversations around her. Gerrit treated her as an equal. He encouraged her to think about big ideas, about justice, about equality. This was the first time Elizabeth felt that she could truly be herself. It was in these moments that her dreams of fighting for women's rights began to take shape. Her desire for change grew stronger with each passing year. She was frustrated by the limits placed on her and on other women. But what could she do? She was still so young. Still, the fire in her heart never dimmed. It only grew stronger as she watched the women around her live restricted lives. Lives that were so much smaller than they deserved. At 16, Elizabeth went to Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary, one of the best schools for girls at the time. It was here that she learned just how much women could achieve when given the chance. The education she received was excellent, but even in this progressive school, Elizabeth could see the limitations placed on women. The curriculum was designed to teach girls how to be good wives and mothers, not how to think critically or question the world around them. Still, Elizabeth soaked up every lesson, determined to use what she learned to fight for a better future. Her time at the seminary was a turning point. She was no longer just a young girl dreaming of change. She was becoming a woman who was ready to act. Elizabeth knew that education was power, and she was determined to use that power to challenge the world's unfairness. When she returned home to Johnstown after school, she was different. Her mind was filled with new ideas, new possibilities. She looked at the women around her, her mother, her sisters, her friends, and she saw their potential. But society did not see it. Society saw only their limitations. Elizabeth felt anger rise within her. How could the world be so blind? How could it not see the strength, the intelligence, the worth of these women? Her father, though still proud of her, hoped she would now settle down, marry, and live the life expected of her. But Elizabeth had bigger dreams. She knew that her life would not follow the traditional path. She didn't want to live quietly. She wanted to make noise, to shout, to stand up and say, "This is not right. Women deserve more." The fire inside her burned brighter than ever, and though she didn't yet know how or when, she knew one thing for sure: she was going to change the world. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born to fight. Chapter 2: A Marriage of Minds and Hearts. Elizabeth Cady was passionate about justice. Ever since she was a young girl, she had felt the weight of injustice, not just in her own life, but in the lives of women everywhere. She knew something had to change, and she was determined to be part of that change. But Elizabeth's journey wasn't one she would walk alone. In 1839, she met Henry Stanton, a man whose ideas about freedom and justice matched her own, at least in many ways. Henry Stanton was not just any man. He was a fierce abolitionist, someone who fought to end the evil of slavery in America. When Elizabeth first met him, she was drawn to his fiery speeches and his dedication to the cause of freedom. His words were like music to her ears. They spoke of justice, equality, and the belief that all people, no matter the color of their skin, deserved to be free. Elizabeth, who had grown up with a deep sense of right and wrong, felt a connection to Henry's fight. She believed in his cause. She admired his courage. And soon she began to admire Henry himself. It wasn't long before Henry and Elizabeth fell in love. But their love wasn't just about romance. No, it was something much deeper. It was a meeting of minds, a bond over shared ideals and dreams. They were partners in the truest sense. Both committed to the fight for justice, both determined to make the world a better place. When they decided to marry, Elizabeth faced a choice that would define her. She had always been strong-willed, independent, and passionate about women's rights. She didn't want marriage to change that. In those days, a wife was often seen as her husband's property. She was expected to obey him, to follow his wishes without question. But Elizabeth wasn't like other women. She couldn't promise to obey Henry, not in the way society expected. So, she made a bold decision. At their wedding, she left out that word, obey, from her vows. It was a small act of defiance, yes, but it was also powerful. Elizabeth was sending a message. Marriage was a partnership of equals, not a relationship of master and servant. She and Henry were a team, two minds working together toward a common goal. Soon after their marriage, Henry and Elizabeth moved to Boston. The city was alive with ideas, filled with people who believed in freedom and justice. It was a place where activists gathered, where speeches were given, where movements were born. Boston was a city of action, and Elizabeth and Henry were right in the middle of it. Henry threw himself into the fight against slavery, working tirelessly to abolish this cruel practice. He traveled, spoke out, and joined other abolitionists in calling for an end to the suffering of millions of enslaved people. Elizabeth supported him fully, proud of his work. She too believed that slavery was a terrible injustice, a stain on the country. But as she stood beside her husband, something began to stir in Elizabeth's mind. She saw the injustice of slavery, yes, but she also saw another kind of injustice, one that no one seemed to be talking about. Women were oppressed too. They had no voice in politics, no right to vote, no say in how they lived their lives. Women couldn't own property, and their wages, if they worked, belonged to their husbands. They were treated as second-class citizens, much like slaves. Yet, no one was fighting for them. No one was calling for women to be free. The more Elizabeth thought about it, the more she realized that this was a battle that needed to be fought too. Women deserved rights. They deserved to be heard. But where to begin? Women were expected to remain quiet, to stay in the background, especially in the political movements of the time. But Elizabeth couldn't stay silent. She couldn't sit back and watch as women's voices were ignored, as their lives were controlled by the men around them. Marriage brought new challenges for Elizabeth. She loved Henry, but she was no ordinary wife. Soon after their wedding, she became pregnant with their first child. Motherhood, with all its joy and responsibility, entered her life. Elizabeth loved her children deeply, and she wanted to be a good mother. But how could she balance this new role with her passion for activism? Could she be both, a loving mother and a fierce fighter for justice? It was a question that weighed on her heart. Society told her that her place was now in the home, that her role was to care for her children and support her husband. But Elizabeth didn't agree. She didn't want to give up her dreams just because she had become a mother. She believed that women could do both. Women could raise families and change the world at the same time, and she was determined to prove it. Still, the struggle wasn't easy. There were days when Elizabeth felt torn between her duties at home and her desire to be part of the larger fight for women's rights. But she refused to choose one over the other. She would be a wife, a mother, and an activist. She would make her voice heard, no matter what. As the years went on, Elizabeth's passion for women's rights grew stronger. She began to see more clearly how deeply ingrained inequality was in society. Everywhere she looked, women were being held back, their talents ignored, their voices silenced, and she couldn't stand it. Something had to be done. While Henry continued his work in the abolitionist movement, Elizabeth started to focus on a new goal. She wanted to bring women's rights to the forefront of the national conversation. This was a different kind of fight, but one that was just as important. Women's freedom was tied to the freedom of all people, and Elizabeth was ready to lead that fight. In her heart, Elizabeth knew that this would not be easy. Change never was. But she had always been strong-willed, always determined. She had faced challenges before, and she had overcome them. Now, with Henry by her side and her mind filled with ideas, she was ready to take on this new challenge. Her marriage to Henry Stanton was not just a union of love, it was a union of minds, of hearts, of shared ideals. Together, they stood for justice. And while Henry's focus remained on ending slavery, Elizabeth began to plant the seeds of a movement that would one day grow into something unstoppable. A movement for the rights of women. As she moved forward into the next chapter of her life, Elizabeth knew one thing for certain. She would not rest until women had the freedom they deserved. It was her calling, her mission, and with every passing day, that mission became clearer and stronger. She was ready. The fight for women's rights was just beginning, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was prepared to lead the way. Chapter 3. Awakening in Seneca Falls. The year was 1848, a time of change, of revolution, but not for women. They still lived in a world where they had no right to vote, no right to own property, and certainly no voice in public life. Their place was the home, nothing more. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton couldn't accept that. She never had. And now, after years of thinking, debating, and dreaming of a better world, she was ready to act. It was a hot July in Seneca Falls, New York. The streets were dusty, the air thick with summer heat. To many, it was an ordinary day in an ordinary town. But to Elizabeth, this was the beginning of something extraordinary, something historic. This was the day she, and a few brave women, would change the world forever. For months, Elizabeth had felt restless. She was living in Seneca Falls, taking care of her children, keeping her home in order, but her mind was full of ideas. She could not stop thinking about the inequality women faced every day. In the eyes of the law, women were little more than property. If they worked, their wages belonged to their husbands. If they married, everything they owned or earned became their husbands'. And voting? That was unthinkable. No woman had ever cast a ballot in America. Elizabeth knew this had to change. But how? She couldn't do it alone. Then came a spark that set everything in motion. Elizabeth's friend, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker and a fellow fighter for justice, came to visit. The two women sat in Elizabeth's parlor talking late into the night. They spoke of slavery, of abolition, of their work to free enslaved people. But soon the conversation shifted. "What about women?" Elizabeth asked. "When will our rights be part of the conversation?" Lucretia nodded. She felt it too. The need for change. The need for women to stand up and demand their rights. Together, they decided to take a bold step. They would hold a convention right there in Seneca Falls to talk about women's rights. It would be the first of its kind, the first time women came together to speak out publicly about their lack of freedom. People told them it was impossible. They said no one would come. Women weren't supposed to speak in public. They weren't supposed to demand anything, least of all the right to vote. But Elizabeth didn't listen. She knew that this was the moment. If they didn't act now, when would they? So, with determination in their hearts, Elizabeth and Lucretia organized the first Women's Rights Convention. They posted a simple notice in the local paper. A convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel at Seneca Falls, July 19th and 20th. That was it. No grand promises, no fiery declarations, just an invitation to change history. The day arrived. Elizabeth stood nervously at the front of the Wesleyan Chapel, her heart pounding. What if no one came? What if they were laughed at? What if the world wasn't ready to hear what they had to say? But then the doors opened, and people began to arrive. Women, so many women from all over the area, walked into the chapel, their eyes wide with curiosity, their faces serious. There were men, too, some who came to support their wives or sisters, others who came out of simple interest. The room filled, slowly at first, then more quickly. By the time the convention began, there were more than 300 people crowded into the small chapel. Elizabeth could hardly believe it. They had come. They were ready to listen. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth stepped forward to speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her notes, but her voice was steady. "We are assembled," she began, "to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free." Her words echoed through the chapel, ringing with a strength and certainty that came from deep within her. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," she continued, "that all men and women are created equal." The room went silent. People leaned forward in their seats. Did she just say women? Yes, she did. Elizabeth was declaring something radical, something unheard of. She was saying that women were equal to men, that they deserved the same rights, the same opportunities, the same freedoms. It was a bold statement, but it was true. And as she spoke, Elizabeth could feel the energy in the room shift. The women were nodding, murmuring in agreement. This wasn't just about words. This was about their lives, their futures. Elizabeth went on to read what would become known as the Declaration of Sentiments. It was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, but this time, it wasn't just men seeking freedom. It was women. The document listed the injustices women faced, being denied the right to vote, being denied access to education, being denied the right to own property. It was a long list, and every woman in the room knew it by heart. They had lived it. Then came the most controversial part, the demand for women's suffrage. Elizabeth stood tall and declared, in no uncertain terms, that women should have the right to vote. This was too much for some. Even among the women present, there were those who thought it was going too far. Voting was a man's right, they said. Women weren't ready for such power. But Elizabeth didn't back down. "If we are to have equality," she said, "we must have the right to vote." At first, there was silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then, the applause began. Slowly at first, then louder, stronger. The women in the room were rising to their feet, clapping, shouting, cheering. They understood what Elizabeth was saying. And they agreed. This was the birth of a movement that would change everything. Over the next 2 days, the convention continued. There were speeches, debates, and discussions. The women talked about education, about property rights, about their place in society. They were filled with passion, with fire, with a new sense of purpose. By the end of the convention, they had signed the Declaration of Sentiments, committing themselves to the fight for women's rights. Elizabeth knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and hard. There would be resistance, ridicule, even anger. But she also knew that they had taken the first step. The women of Seneca Falls had spoken, and they wouldn't be silenced again. As Elizabeth left the chapel that day, her heart was full of hope, full of determination. She had stood in front of a crowd and declared that women were equal, and they had listened. They had believed. The fight for women's suffrage had begun, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was ready to lead the charge. Chapter 5. A Mother, a Fighter. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7 children. Yes, 7! From the outside, her life seemed chaotic, filled with the sounds of little feet running through the halls, laughter, cries, and endless responsibilities. But did that slow her down? No. Never. She was a mother, yes, but she was also a fighter, and nothing, not even the demands of motherhood, would stop her from changing the world. From the moment she married Henry Stanton, Elizabeth had known her life would be different. She didn't fit the mold of the perfect wife or perfect mother that society expected her to be. But she didn't care. She believed that women could do more, that they could be more than just caregivers, and she was determined to prove it through her own life. Her home was full of life. Laughter echoed from room to room as her children played, argued, and explored. There were always toys scattered across the floor, half-finished drawings on the table, and the sweet sound of voices singing or shouting. It was a house filled with energy, but it was also a house filled with ideas. While other women focused solely on household chores, Elizabeth's home was a place of revolution. In between caring for her children, Elizabeth worked. She wrote. She planned. Her desk was always stacked with books, letters, and drafts of speeches. She would spend hours at night, after her children were asleep, scribbling down her thoughts, ideas racing through her mind. She had so much to say, and she knew that every word, every speech, every article she wrote was part of a much bigger fight, a fight for the rights of women everywhere. "Why should being a mother stop me from changing the world?" she would say, her eyes shining with determination. Elizabeth didn't believe that motherhood and activism had to be separate. No, she believed they could go hand in hand, and she was right. Raising 7 children was no small task. Each day was filled with the challenges of feeding, dressing, teaching, and comforting them. And yet, Elizabeth always found time to do her work. She didn't just balance her responsibilities, she blended them. Her children were part of her mission. She raised them to believe in justice, to understand the importance of equality, and to question the world around them. They grew up surrounded by ideas of freedom and fairness, and by their mother's fierce passion for change. But it wasn't easy. There were days when Elizabeth felt exhausted, when the weight of her responsibilities seemed almost too much to bear. She was, after all, only human. There were moments when she doubted herself, wondering if she could really make a difference while raising so many children. But those doubts never lasted long. She would always return to her work with renewed energy, pushing forward, knowing that the fight for women's rights was worth every struggle. Elizabeth's husband, Henry, was often away. He traveled for his work as an abolitionist, fighting against the evil of slavery. So, Elizabeth was left to manage the household alone much of the time. But she didn't mind. In fact, she thrived in the chaos. Her home was her battlefield, and she was both the general and the soldier. In between rocking babies to sleep and helping with school lessons, she wrote speeches that would inspire generations. She penned letters to her allies in the women's rights movement, strategizing about how they could push forward. Her mind never stopped working. She was constantly thinking about new ways to advance the cause, new ways to make sure that women's voices were heard. And Elizabeth wasn't alone. Her home became a gathering place for other women who shared her vision. They would come, sometimes with their own children in tow, and sit in her parlor discussing the future. These meetings were electric. Ideas flew back and forth, plans were made, and strategies were drawn up. Elizabeth was at the center of it all, her mind sharp, her heart full of purpose. She knew that what they were doing was revolutionary. They were dreaming of a world where women could vote, own property, and have a say in the decisions that affected their lives. A world where women weren't seen as second-class citizens, but as equals. It was a bold dream, and Elizabeth was determined to make it a reality. Her children, too, were part of this revolution. They grew up watching their mother work tirelessly for a cause she believed in. They learned, through her example, that women could be strong, that they could fight for what was right, and that they didn't have to choose between family and activism. Elizabeth's daughters, in particular, saw in their mother a model of what a woman could be: fierce, intelligent, and unafraid to challenge the world. But Elizabeth's fight wasn't just about speeches and meetings. It was about living her beliefs every day. She refused to accept the traditional roles that society had assigned to women. She taught her daughters to be independent, to think for themselves, and to never accept limitations just because of their gender. Her sons, too, were raised to respect women and to understand that equality wasn't just a women's issue. It was a human issue. Elizabeth's home, with all its noise, mess, and life, was a place of revolution. It was where the future of women's rights was being shaped day by day, moment by moment. Every conversation, every letter, every meeting that took place within its walls was part of the larger movement that would eventually lead to the right to vote, the right to own property, and so much more. In many ways, Elizabeth's life was an example of what she was fighting for. She was proving, through her actions, that women could be both mothers and leaders, that they could raise children and change the world. And in doing so, she was laying the foundation for future generations of women who would follow in her footsteps. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was more than just a mother. She was more than just a fighter. She was both, and she refused to choose between the two. Her life was proof that women didn't have to give up their dreams when they became mothers. Instead, they could bring their children along with them on the journey. As she looked around her bustling home, filled with the laughter and chaos of her children, Elizabeth knew one thing for certain. Her work was far from over. But she was ready. She had always been ready. Her home, her heart, her mind were all part of the fight. And as long as she had breath, she would keep fighting. For her children, for all women, for the world. Chapter 6. The War Within, the Fight for Equality Among All. The year was 1861. The United States was tearing apart at the seams. The Civil War had begun, a brutal conflict that would tear brother from brother, state from state, and leave the country forever changed. The war wasn't just about land or politics. It was about freedom, the freedom of millions of enslaved people whose lives were bound in chains, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton couldn't stand by and watch. She had always been a fighter, always believed in justice, and now that fight extended far beyond women's rights. As the cannons fired and soldiers marched to battle, Elizabeth felt her focus shift. The fight to end slavery consumed the nation, and she threw herself into the cause. She had long been an abolitionist, standing side by side with her husband Henry and her friend, the great Frederick Douglass. The cries of enslaved people, their longing for freedom, echoed in her heart, just as deeply as the cries of women who were denied their rights. The two struggles felt intertwined, both about dignity, both about justice. As the war raged on, Elizabeth spoke out passionately, writing letters, giving speeches, and urging others to join the fight for freedom. She called for the end of slavery and for the emancipation of all enslaved people. This was a time of great moral urgency, and Elizabeth knew it. She believed with all her soul that the nation could not truly be free until everyone, black and white, man and woman, was free. But even as victory neared and the end of slavery was in sight, another battle began to brew. It was a battle within the hearts of those who had fought so hard for justice. The question now was, what comes next? With the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery was officially abolished. It was a moment of celebration, of triumph. But the fight wasn't over. Now, the nation faced a new challenge: Reconstruction. The question of rights for African Americans became urgent. Could they vote? Could they own land? Could they truly live as free citizens? Elizabeth, always committed to equality, believed the answer was clear. Yes, of course. But then, another question emerged. What about women? Should women, too, be granted the right to vote? Should women, who had fought so hard for justice, be included in these new laws of equality? For Elizabeth, the answer was obvious. Justice cannot be divided, she said. If we fight for the rights of one group, we must fight for the rights of all. But not everyone agreed. Many of her allies in the abolitionist movement, including Frederick Douglass, believed that the focus should remain on African American men. Women's rights, they said, could wait. They argued that pushing for both could jeopardize everything. The country wasn't ready for such a radical idea. African American men were in desperate need of protection and rights after the horrors of slavery. It was their time. Women could wait. But Elizabeth didn't want to wait. She couldn't wait. She had spent too many years watching women be ignored, silenced, and pushed aside. How could they now, in this moment of change, be asked to step back again? It was a painful divide, a divide between two causes she believed in so deeply. Her heart ached. Frederick Douglass, her dear friend and ally, stood on one side. They had fought together for freedom for so long, but now they disagreed. Elizabeth believed that equality had to be for everyone: black, white, male, female. But Douglass felt that this was the time for African American men. He worried that including women's rights in the fight might weaken their chances. "This is the Negro's hour," he said. Elizabeth understood his pain. She knew what he had endured, what millions of black Americans had suffered. But still, she could not accept that women should be told to wait again. She believed in her heart that justice was justice. Justice cannot have two faces, she argued. It must be for all, or it is for none. It was a time of deep reflection for Elizabeth. She questioned herself, her beliefs, and the path ahead. She faced criticism from those who once supported her. Some thought she was asking for too much, pushing too hard. Others called her selfish for insisting that women be included in this crucial moment of change. But Elizabeth couldn't silence the voice inside her that screamed for equality. Even when it cost her friendships, even when it meant standing alone, she didn't waver. The fight for women's suffrage had already begun, but now it faced new challenges. Some saw the two movements, abolition and women's rights, as separate. But Elizabeth couldn't see it that way. To her, they were one and the same. "How can we call ourselves a nation of freedom," she asked, "if half of our citizens are still denied their rights?" She wasn't just talking about race. She was talking about gender. As the 14th and 15th Amendments were drafted, granting rights and citizenship to African American men, Elizabeth fought to include women. She fought fiercely, with every ounce of her strength. But the tide was against her. In the end, the amendments passed without including women. It was a bitter defeat. Yet, even in defeat, Elizabeth did not lose hope. She knew that the fight was not over. The country had taken a step forward, yes, but it had not yet arrived at true equality. Not until women, too, were given the right to vote and the freedom to shape their own futures. It was a time of challenge for Elizabeth, personally and politically. She lost support from some of her oldest allies, and many in the abolitionist movement distanced themselves from her. But she never regretted standing up for what she believed in. She had fought for the rights of African Americans and would continue to do so. But she would also keep fighting for women, no matter how long it took. Elizabeth knew that real equality could not be divided. It could not be split into parts or rationed out. Equality, in its truest form, had to be for all. And she would keep fighting until the day that every person, black or white, male or female, was free to live as an equal in the eyes of the law. The war within, between the rights of African Americans and the rights of women, was painful, but it was also a turning point. It forced Elizabeth to dig even deeper into her beliefs, to stand firm, and to never give up on her vision of justice for all. And though the road ahead was still long, Elizabeth Cady Stanton knew one thing for certain. The fight for women's rights was far from over, and she would be there every step of the way until it was won. Chapter 7. The Power of Words. Elizabeth Cady Stanton knew something very important, something that most people overlooked. The greatest battles weren't fought with swords or guns or fists. No. The most powerful battles, the ones that changed the world, were fought with words. And Elizabeth's greatest weapon was her pen. She didn't need to march into battle with armor or stand on the front lines with a flag. She had a mind full of ideas, a heart full of passion, and the ability to put those thoughts on paper in ways that made people think, made them question, made them angry, and sometimes made them inspired. From the very beginning of her fight for women's rights, Elizabeth understood the power of words. She knew that if she could make people listen, really listen, they might begin to see the world the way she saw it, a world where women were treated as equals, where they could vote, own property, and live free. So, she wrote, letters, speeches, articles. She filled pages with her arguments, her frustrations, and her hopes. But it wasn't just about writing for her allies. No. Elizabeth wanted to reach everyone. She knew her words had to go beyond the circles of those who already agreed with her. They had to reach the people who were resistant, who didn't believe women deserved rights. Her writing had to be clear, bold, and yes, sometimes shocking. If she didn't challenge society, who would? Elizabeth's words stirred people. They struck nerves. They made people uncomfortable. She called out the injustice of women being denied the vote. She pointed out the hypocrisy of a country that claimed to believe in freedom but kept women in chains of tradition and silence. And as she wrote, her words traveled through newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches delivered at conventions across the country. People read her words, and they talked about them. Some agreed, some didn't, but no one could ignore her. Then came her most daring work, the Woman's Bible. Elizabeth had always questioned the way religion was used to control women. She saw how religious teachings were twisted to keep women in their place, to make them obedient and silent. "Obey your husband," the Bible said. "Women should remain quiet in churches." Elizabeth couldn't stand it. How could sacred texts be used to justify oppression? So, in 1895, she decided to do something unthinkable. She began writing the Woman's Bible, a book that would question, and reinterpret the Bible's teachings on women. It was a radical, dangerous move. No one had ever dared to challenge the Bible this way, at least not publicly. But Elizabeth was not afraid. She believed that if women were ever going to be truly free, they had to think freely. They had to question everything, even the things that seemed untouchable. And for many, the Bible was untouchable. The woman's Bible wasn't meant to destroy religion. No. Elizabeth wanted to free women from the narrow interpretations that had kept them in chains for centuries. She argued that the Bible had been used over time as a tool of patriarchy, a way for men to keep power over women. She wanted to show that the Bible could be understood differently, that it didn't have to be used as a weapon against women's rights. But not everyone saw it that way. The reaction was intense. People were shocked, outraged. How dare she? How dare Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a woman no less, question the Word of God? Even some of her closest allies in the women's suffrage movement distanced themselves from her. They thought she had gone too far. "We cannot win the vote if we alienate religious people," they said. "Elizabeth, you're making enemies we can't afford to have." It was true. The woman's Bible was not popular among many suffragists, including her longtime friend and partner in the fight for women's rights, Susan B. Anthony. Susan admired Elizabeth, but she didn't agree with this. She believed the movement needed to stay focused on getting the vote, not on challenging religion. Elizabeth felt the sting of their rejection. It hurt deeply to be criticized by the very people she had fought alongside for so many years. But did she regret writing it? No. Not for a second. She stood firm in her beliefs. Elizabeth had never been one to back down when the fight got tough, and this was no different. She knew that what she had written was important. It was dangerous, yes. It was controversial. But it was the truth as she saw it. If women are ever to be free, she wrote, they must challenge the teachings that have been used to keep them in chains. She believed this with all her heart, and even though the woman's Bible cost her some friends and allies, she knew that her words had made an impact. People were talking. People were thinking. And that was exactly what she wanted. Throughout her life, Elizabeth used her words to challenge the status quo. She wrote passionately about the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to have a voice in society. And her words traveled far beyond what she could have imagined. Even when she was no longer able to stand on stages or travel across the country, her pen remained her voice, and it was loud. Elizabeth's words lived in every speech, every article, every letter she sent out into the world. They lived in the minds of the women who read them, who were inspired by them, who carried on her fight. And they lived on, long after her death, in the movements she helped to create, in the rights that women eventually won. Even though the woman's Bible caused controversy, it was just one chapter in a long story of Elizabeth's influence. Her other writings continued to inspire. Her speeches were reprinted, her ideas spread, and her legacy grew. She didn't just help shape the women's suffrage movement. She gave it words that could last through the years, through the battles, and through the victories. In the end, Elizabeth's greatest weapon wasn't her fiery speeches, or her ability to organize, or even her relentless activism. It was her words, words that could inspire and infuriate, words that could lift people up and tear down the walls of oppression, words that gave women the power to think for themselves, to question, to demand, and to fight for their own freedom. Elizabeth Cady Stanton may have passed from this world, but her words, they never died. They lived on, echoing through history, through every vote cast by a woman, every law passed in favor of women's rights, and every person who dared to believe in true equality. Chapter 8. The Road to Suffrage. The road to suffrage was long, winding, and filled with obstacles. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton never gave up. How could she? The fight for women's right to vote had become her life's work, her passion, her mission, and no amount of boos, hisses, or laughter could silence her voice. Elizabeth knew that what she was asking for seemed impossible to many. The idea that women, who had long been considered unfit for politics or leadership, could cast a vote in elections. To some, it was laughable. To others, it was threatening. But to Elizabeth, it was justice, plain and simple. She couldn't understand how a nation that prided itself on freedom and democracy could deny half its population the right to vote. How could they call this country free if women were still treated as second-class citizens? And so she set out on a journey. She traveled from town to town, from state to state, speaking to anyone who would listen, and even to those who wouldn't. Elizabeth stood in front of crowds large and small, and she spoke with a fire that couldn't be ignored. The ballot, she said, is the most powerful weapon in the hands of a citizen, and women too deserve that weapon. But oh, how hard it was. She faced ridicule at nearly every turn. There were men in the crowd, sometimes even women, who laughed at her, who shouted at her to go home and mind her children. They called her names, insulted her, tried to shame her. "Women have no place in politics," they shouted. "Go back to your kitchen." Elizabeth stood tall. She had heard it all before. The insults, the laughter. It didn't shake her. She knew this fight was bigger than her, bigger than the moment. "I am not fighting for the moment," she would say, her voice steady, her eyes fierce. "I am fighting for the future." And that's what kept her going, even on the hardest days. She wasn't alone, of course. By her side was her dear friend Susan B. Anthony. Together, they formed a dynamic duo. Susan often took to the road, traveling to speak, while Elizabeth stayed home to write the speeches and articles that would inspire the movement. Susan was the face of the campaign, traveling tirelessly across the country, while Elizabeth was the mind behind the words. Their partnership was unbreakable, their bond forged in the fires of a shared dream. But this fight wasn't just about speeches and rallies. It was about changing minds, changing hearts, and changing laws. It was about convincing state governments to pass laws that would allow women to vote. Elizabeth and Susan lobbied state legislators, knocking on doors, writing petitions, and never giving up, even when they were told no again and again. In 1869, the movement saw its first glimmer of success. The Wyoming Territory granted women the right to vote. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For Elizabeth, it was proof that change was possible. If Wyoming could see the truth of women's suffrage, so could the rest of the nation. Slowly, other states began to follow: Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. State by state, the movement grew stronger, and more women and men joined the cause. But victory was still far away. The suffrage movement faced fierce opposition, not just from ordinary people, but from politicians, newspapers, and even religious leaders. Many believed that giving women the vote would destroy the family, that women would abandon their homes, their children, their roles as caregivers. A woman's place is in the home, they argued. Politics is for men. It was a deeply ingrained belief, one that had been passed down through generations. But Elizabeth didn't believe it. She never had. She knew that women could be both mothers and voters, wives and leaders. She knew that women had the intelligence, the passion, and the strength to make decisions for themselves and their country. and she knew that one day the rest of the world would see it too. As the years went on, Elizabeth grew older, but her fire never dimmed. She continued to write, to speak, to push for change. She saw new generations of women step up, inspired by her words and her determination. The suffrage movement had become a national force, and Elizabeth's influence was everywhere. She was proud of how far they had come, but she also knew that there was still a long way to go. She often wondered if she would live to see the day when women could vote. Deep down, she knew that she might not. But that didn't matter to her. Elizabeth wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for her daughters, for her granddaughters, for women she would never meet. This fight is for the future, she reminded herself again and again. It gave her strength on the days when progress seemed slow, when defeat loomed on the horizon. In 1890, two rival suffrage organizations merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Elizabeth was named the organization's first president. It was a great honor, a recognition of her decades of work, but she wasn't ready to slow down. There was still so much to do. She continued to speak out, even when her body grew tired. Her mind, however, was as sharp as ever. In her final years, Elizabeth watched as the movement she had helped to build marched on, gaining strength with every passing year. Women across the country were organizing, marching, demanding their rights. The momentum was unstoppable, and though Elizabeth knew her time was coming to an end, she could feel that the victory was near. In 1902, at the age of 86, Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away. She did not live to see women win the right to vote, but her legacy was secure. She had laid the foundation for a movement that would change the course of history. And 8 years after her death, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote in the United States. Elizabeth's words, her fire, her determination, lived on. She had fought for the future, and in the end, the future had listened. The road to suffrage had been long, but it had been worth every step, every struggle, every battle. And though Elizabeth did not see the final victory with her own eyes, she had always known that it would come. "I am not fighting for the moment," she had said. "I am fighting for the future." And she was right. Chapter 9. Struggles and Setbacks. The road to justice is rarely a straight line. And for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it was a path filled with twists, turns, and painful setbacks. She had always known the fight for women's rights wouldn't be easy, but knowing that didn't make the defeats any less heartbreaking. There were moments, many moments, when it seemed like the fight was lost, when victory seemed farther away than ever. It wasn't just the opposition from society, the men who shouted at her to stay in her place, the newspapers that mocked her, the politicians who refused to listen. No, the hardest blows often came from closer, from the people she had counted on, the ones who were supposed to be on her side. Laws that she had worked so hard to get passed were rejected time and again. She saw the suffrage movement take one step forward, only to be pushed 2 steps back. States where she thought they had a chance to make progress turned against them. Votes in Congress that seemed promising ended in bitter disappointment, and at times it felt as though the entire world was against her. Elizabeth had spent her life pouring her heart into this movement. She had written speeches that stirred crowds to tears, letters that were sent far and wide, and books that challenged the very foundation of society. But even with all that effort, change seemed agonizingly slow. Each rejection, each broken promise, each moment of defeat weighed heavily on her. And then there were the personal heartbreaks, the ones that hurt even more deeply. One by one, Elizabeth saw people she loved drift away from the cause. Friends who had once stood beside her, who had believed in the fight for women's rights, began to doubt. They said the movement was too radical, that it was asking for too much. Some of them, people she had fought alongside for years, turned their backs on her entirely. And it wasn't just friends. Even members of her own family found it hard to support her as she pushed forward with her bold vision for women's equality. But the hardest blow of all? The loss of her beloved brother-in-arms, Frederick Douglass. After the Civil War, when the fight for African American men's rights took center stage, Douglass and Elizabeth found themselves on opposite sides of a painful divide. While she believed that the fight for women's suffrage should move forward alongside the fight for African American rights, Douglass felt that it was not the time for both. He believed that securing the vote for black men was the urgent priority and that women's suffrage could come later. It hurt Elizabeth deeply to lose his support. They had shared so much, years of working together, dreaming of a better world for all, and now he no longer stood by her side. The friendship wasn't entirely broken, but it was changed, and it was a loss that she carried with her. Then came the losses closer to home, her own family. Elizabeth had 7 children, and she loved them dearly, but even in her own household, there were struggles. One of her sons, Theodore, opposed her involvement in the suffrage movement. He thought she should step back, stop pushing so hard. It was a painful blow to hear those words from her own child. How could someone she had raised, someone she had taught to value justice, turn away from her fight? And there were other personal tragedies. Elizabeth's dear husband, Henry, who had once stood beside her in the early years of their marriage, drifted further and further from the cause as time went on. He supported her in his own way, but he didn't share her fierce dedication to women's suffrage. In many ways, Elizabeth had always felt alone in her marriage, especially as her passion for the movement grew stronger. Yet, through all these setbacks, through the defeats, the broken friendships, the personal losses, Elizabeth never stopped. Even when her body began to weaken with age, her spirit remained as strong as ever. She knew, deep in her heart, that this fight wasn't just for her. It wasn't even for the women of her generation. It was for the generations to come. She was fighting for daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters who might never know her name, but who would live in a world shaped by her courage. Every defeat made her more determined. Every time a law was rejected, she picked up her pen and wrote another letter, another speech. Every time a protest was broken up or silenced, she found a new way to rally the troops. Elizabeth was a woman who couldn't be silenced. Her words, her voice, her passion could not be stopped. She traveled the country even when she was tired. She stood on stages and spoke to crowds even when she felt the weight of years on her shoulders. And when she couldn't travel anymore, she wrote. She wrote letters, articles, and books, reminding the world that the fight was not over. She never let herself believe it was too late. Every step we take, she said, brings us closer to equality. And she was right. Little by little, the movement grew stronger. Each small victory, each woman who joined the cause, each man who began to see the truth of their fight was a step forward. Elizabeth knew that change was slow. She had seen it, lived it, but she also knew that change was possible. She believed it with every fiber of her being, and that belief kept her going, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. By the time Elizabeth reached her later years, she had lived through more defeats and heartbreaks than most people could imagine. But her spirit was unbreakable. She may not have lived to see women win the right to vote, but she never doubted that they would. The setbacks, the struggles, they were just part of the journey. Each one only made her more certain that the fight was worth fighting. As Elizabeth Cady Stanton looked back on her life, she saw the battles, the losses, and the victories all woven together. She had given everything she had to this cause, and though the road had been hard, so hard, she never once regretted the path she had chosen. Her fight was for the future, and she knew in the depths of her soul that the future would bring the equality she had dreamed of, one small step at a time. Chapter 10. Passing the Torch. The years passed, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began to feel the weight of time. Her body grew weaker, her steps slower, but her spirit burned just as fiercely as it had in her youth. She had spent decades fighting for women's rights, pouring her heart and soul into the movement. She had seen victories and defeats, cheers and jeers, but the one thing that never changed was her belief in the cause. As Elizabeth grew older, she knew it was time to step back. Time to let the younger generation take the lead. It wasn't an easy decision. After all, this movement had been her life's work. But she understood that a revolution isn't carried by one person alone. It grows, it spreads, it passes from hand to hand like a torch, lighting the way for those who come next. And so, Elizabeth watched as younger women she had inspired, took up the fight. They were bold, passionate, determined, just like she had been. They had read her words, listened to her speeches, and now they were ready to carry the movement forward. These women were not just followers. They were leaders in their own right, filled with ideas and energy, ready to continue what Elizabeth had started. Elizabeth felt a deep sense of pride. She had planted the seeds of change, and now she was watching them grow. She had opened the door for a new generation of women who would not accept silence, who would not accept second-class status. They would continue the battle for suffrage, for equality, for a better world. And Elizabeth? She would be there, guiding them, even from a distance, even as her role shifted from leader to mentor. One of the most remarkable things about Elizabeth was her willingness to pass the torch. She didn't cling to power or demand the spotlight. No, she understood that real change would only come if the movement was bigger than any one person. She welcomed new voices, encouraged fresh ideas, and gave the younger women the space to grow into their own roles as leaders. She watched as Susan B. Anthony, her lifelong friend and partner in the struggle, continued to travel, to speak, to rally women and men to the cause. Though Elizabeth's health no longer allowed her to take the stage, Susan carried on the work, with Elizabeth's words echoing in every speech, every plea for justice. Their partnership was unshakable, even as the years went by. But it wasn't just Susan. New faces emerged, young women full of fire, ready to take the fight for women's suffrage to new heights. Elizabeth saw these women rise, and though she couldn't stand beside them in person, she was with them in spirit. She wrote letters, she offered advice, and most importantly, she encouraged them to be bold. "Do not be afraid to challenge the world," she would say. "Do not be afraid to demand what is rightfully yours." Elizabeth was watching a movement become a force of nature. What had once been a few voices crying out for justice had grown into a national movement. Women were organizing, marching, demanding their rights with a determination that could not be ignored. State by state, the push for suffrage was gaining momentum, and though the path was still long, the fire that Elizabeth had lit could not be extinguished. There were moments when Elizabeth would sit in her quiet home, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She had started this fight at a time when no one believed it was possible. When people had laughed at the idea of women voting, when society had told her she was asking for too much, but look at how far they had come. Elizabeth knew that change was slow, painfully slow, but she also knew that real change, lasting change, was worth the wait. She often thought about the future, about the women who would come after her. She wouldn't live to see the final victory. She knew that. But that didn't matter. "I am not fighting for myself," she had always said. "I am fighting for the future." And she had done exactly that. She had built a foundation for future generations to stand on, a foundation that would carry them to victory. Elizabeth had started something powerful, something unstoppable. And even though she would not see the day when women cast their ballots in national elections, she had no doubt that day would come. She could feel it in the air, in the energy of the women around her, in the growing support for the cause. Victory was on the horizon, and Elizabeth knew that her work had not been in vain. In her later years, Elizabeth continued to write. She couldn't travel like she used to, but her words still had power. She wrote letters, articles, and books, always pushing the movement forward, always reminding people that the fight was not over. Even as her body grew frail, her mind remained sharp, filled with ideas and dreams of a world where women were truly equal. Her most famous work in those years was The Woman's Bible, a controversial and daring book that challenged the way religion had been used to oppress women. It was bold, and it cost her support from some allies. But Elizabeth didn't care. She had never been afraid to speak her mind, to question the status quo, to challenge the foundations of society if it meant paving the way for women's freedom. And as the years passed, Elizabeth found peace in knowing that she had done her part. She had started a movement, sparked a revolution, and passed the torch to the next generation. She had fought tirelessly for women's rights, and now she was watching the world begin to change. The doors she had worked so hard to open were swinging wide, and women were stepping through them, ready to claim their place in the world. Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away in 1902, at the age of 86. She did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, the amendment that would grant women the right to vote. But she knew it was coming. She had laid the groundwork, and she had passed the torch. The fight would continue, and the victory would be won. And so, even as she left this world, Elizabeth left behind a legacy that would echo through the ages. She had not just fought for women's rights. She had opened the door for future generations to walk through. She had shown them the way. And though she did not live to see the final victory, her spirit was there, in every vote cast by a woman, in every right won, in every step forward toward equality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had passed the torch, and the flame would never go out. Chapter 11. The Legacy Lives On. Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away on October 26, 1902. She was 86 years old. Her heart had finally grown weary after a lifetime of fighting for justice, for women, for the future. But as her spirit left this world, her legacy remained, burning brighter than ever. The flame she had ignited, the fire for women's equality, would not be extinguished. It would only grow, carried on by the hands of the women who followed her, those who had been inspired by her words, her strength, and her relentless courage. 18 years later, in 1920, women across the United States finally won the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was passed, and the dream Elizabeth had dedicated her life to became a reality. She did not live to see it, but she had known, deep in her heart, that the day would come. Her words, her ideas had planted the seeds that would grow into this victory. It was a triumph she had fought for, and though she wasn't there to witness it, her spirit was woven into every step of that long, hard-won journey. But Elizabeth's legacy didn't stop with the right to vote. Oh no. She had fought for so much more than that. Her vision was broader, deeper, more ambitious. She had dreamed of a world where women weren't just given the right to vote, but where they were treated as equals in every way, politically, socially, economically. And it wasn't just about women. Elizabeth had always believed in equality for all people. Black, white, male, female. Every person deserved dignity, respect, and the opportunity to shape their own future. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth's lifelong friend and ally, carried the torch after Elizabeth's death. Susan continued to fight for the suffrage movement, speaking out until her own passing in 1906. The two women had been an unstoppable force, partners in the struggle, and even after Elizabeth was gone, her words continued to echo in Susan's speeches. It was Elizabeth's declaration of sentiments from Seneca Falls that had lit the spark for the movement. A declaration that said, for the first time, that all men and women are created equal. As time passed, new voices joined the movement. Women like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who took up the fight with fierce determination. They pushed even harder, demanding that the government take women's rights seriously. Alice Paul was relentless, organizing protests and hunger strikes, even being imprisoned for her activism. But through it all, Elizabeth's spirit was there, guiding them, reminding them of the power of persistence, the power of standing up for what was right. In fact, Alice Paul once said, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the philosopher of the woman's movement. She saw with her mind's eye the ideal, and she worked for that ideal all her life. Elizabeth's legacy was not just in her actions, but in the ideas she left behind, the belief that women could and should claim their rightful place in society. And it wasn't just in the suffrage movement that her influence lived on. Elizabeth had challenged the very foundations of society. Through her writing, particularly the Woman's Bible, she questioned the religious teachings that had been used to keep women in subservient roles. This was a radical move, one that shocked even some of her closest allies. But Elizabeth never shied away from controversy. She had always believed that if women were to be truly free, they needed to think freely, question everything, even the things society told them were sacred. Her bravery, her willingness to speak out, no matter the cost, left an indelible mark on history. The women who followed in her footsteps, whether they were fighting for the right to vote, for better wages, for education, or for the right to control their own bodies, were standing on the foundation Elizabeth had built. Her work had paved the way for the future. Her legacy lives on in the laws that protect women today. The right to vote was just the beginning. In the years that followed, women fought for and won many more rights. The right to own property, the right to education, the right to equal pay, the right to make decisions about their own bodies. These victories, each one hard-earned, each one a step toward equality, were possible because Elizabeth Cady Stanton dared to dream of a world that could be different. But perhaps her greatest legacy is in the hearts of women. Elizabeth gave women something they had been denied for so long, a voice. She showed them that their voices mattered, that they had the right to speak out, to demand change, to challenge the systems that oppressed them. Her courage, her determination, inspired generations of women to follow in her footsteps. Today, her influence can still be felt. When women march in the streets for their rights, when they stand at podiums demanding justice, when they speak out against inequality, they are carrying forward Elizabeth's legacy. Her words still echo in the halls of justice, in the classrooms where young girls learn that they can be anything they want to be, in the workplaces where women demand equal pay and respect, in the legislative chambers where laws are written that ensure women have the same rights as men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton may have passed from this world, but her ideas, her vision, her unbreakable belief in equality live on. Every woman who votes, who runs for office, who stands up for her rights, is part of the legacy that Elizabeth left behind. And it wasn't just women. Elizabeth had fought for justice for all people, regardless of race or gender. Her belief in universal equality still resonates today, in every movement that seeks to break down barriers and build a more just world. Her voice, strong and unwavering, still calls to us from the past, reminding us that the fight for equality is never over, that progress comes from those who dare to stand up, who dare to speak out, who dare to believe that change is possible. Elizabeth Cady Stanton started a revolution, and that revolution continues stronger than ever in the hearts of everyone who dares to dream of a better world. Her legacy lives on. Chapter 12. A Voice That Never Fades. Today, when we speak of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we don't just speak of a woman from history. We speak of a voice that never fades, a force that still echoes through time. Her life was not just a series of events. It was a dream, a battle, a fire for justice, a dream of equality that didn't end with her death, but continues to inspire. Still flickering, still alive, in the hearts of women and men around the world. Elizabeth wasn't just any woman. She was a trailblazer. A woman who dared to question the way things were and imagined how they could be. In a time when women were told to sit down, be quiet, and follow the rules, Elizabeth stood up. She spoke loudly, boldly. She didn't ask for permission. She demanded justice. But who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton really? What made her different? What gave her the strength to keep going, even when the world seemed determined to silence her? The answer lies in her story, in the experiences that shaped her, the battles she fought, and the fire in her heart that refused to die. Born in 1815, Elizabeth was a girl who grew up surrounded by limitations. She saw how women were treated, how they were expected to be silent, obedient, and powerless. She watched as her brothers were sent to school and given opportunities that were never offered to her. And it hurt. It lit a fire in her that would never go out. But rather than accepting this as the way things were, Elizabeth began to dream. She dreamed of a world where women could be equals, where they could learn, vote, and make their own decisions. And from that young age, Elizabeth knew that she wasn't just going to dream, she was going to fight. Her journey wasn't easy. She faced ridicule. She faced rejection. Even her father, who she loved dearly, once said, "I wish you were a boy." Those words cut deep, but they also fueled her passion. They drove her to prove that a woman could be just as powerful, just as intelligent, just as deserving of freedom as any man. Elizabeth's life became a relentless pursuit of justice. She fought for the abolition of slavery. She fought for women's suffrage. She fought for the right of women to own property, to have a say in their own lives, to be seen as equals. Every word she wrote, every speech she gave was part of that battle. And though there were moments of defeat, moments of heartbreak, she never gave up. She knew that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for the future. For women she would never meet, for generations yet to be born. Today, we walk in the world that Elizabeth dreamed of. Women can vote. They can own property. They can be leaders, teachers, doctors, and lawmakers. These rights, these freedoms, exist because of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton who dared to challenge the system, who refused to accept the world as it was. But her fight, her vision, didn't stop with her. The dream of equality isn't just about the rights women won in the past. It's about the ongoing struggle for justice in the present. It's about the women and men who continue to push for equality in all its forms, whether that's equal pay, reproductive rights, or the fight against discrimination. Elizabeth's voice lives on in every person who stands up and says, "This is not right. We can do better." It lives on in the marches, in the protests, in the speeches, and in the laws that are still being written today. Her legacy is not just something we look back on. It's something we live every day. And here's the thing about Elizabeth's voice. It's not just for women. Her dream of equality was a dream for all people. She believed that justice couldn't be divided. That men and women, black and white, rich and poor, all deserved the same rights, the same respect. Her fight was a fight for humanity, for a world where every person is treated with dignity. That's why Elizabeth's story isn't just history. It's a reminder that one voice, one dream, one person can change the world. It doesn't matter how impossible the fight seems. It doesn't matter how many people say no. What matters is that you keep going, that you refuse to give up. Elizabeth taught us that change doesn't come easily. It comes from the sweat and tears of those who are brave enough to stand up and demand it. And sometimes, change takes time. Elizabeth didn't live to see women win the right to vote, but she knew it would happen. She knew that her fight was bigger than herself, that it would carry on long after she was gone. And carry on it did. Because of Elizabeth, because of her courage, her determination, her words. We live in a different world today. A better world. But the fight isn't over. Elizabeth's legacy is a call to action, a call to keep pushing for justice, for equality, for the rights of every person, no matter their gender, their race, or their background. So, when we remember Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we don't just remember a woman from the past. We remember a woman who changed the future. We remember a voice that refuses to fade, that continues to inspire, to challenge, to push us toward a world where everyone is truly equal. Her story is not just a chapter in a history book. It's a living, breathing force. It's a reminder that each of us has the power to make a difference, that our voices matter, that our dreams, no matter how impossible they seem, can become reality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was that voice, that dream, that woman, and her legacy? It lives on, forever.